White colored Joe. That was an orange. Orange.
There's a nice big engine.
We'll have to take these engines out and bring them in just so they can take a move.
Helper was a railroad center too. wasn't
Yeah.
it? Big railroad
Division.
Like I told you, we thought it was just a pain in the neck.
It's a division point.
That's where those 3700s were painted. That was the sandbox for the front engine.
That looks like a
When the
big.
war came on, they had to change them because it looked like a Jap flag.
Ooh, that's a big one. That's a big Millie, isn't it?
Yeah, he loved that engine.
What'd you call it?
That's a Malley, 38, 37. That's me up in the cab. Elmer Parker, he's still alive. Jim Bresnahan, he's in Grand Junction.
So there it is. Yeah, it's a division point. Helper, that's where they put on the helper engines to go up over the pass.
It was, right over there, yeah.
There's the town. It looks just the same
All
now.
gone now, a long time. That's it.
You know, as advertising, that thing wasn't worth 5 cents. The whole picture wasn't worth 10 cents when they made it, and now it's getting valuable every year.
Every instant. Well,
Every year it's getting more valuable.
there's another way of looking at it. Hell of an advertising dollar. Some of those places are still there, and we're selling them. We're going to push them on prime time. Next time you're in Helper, stop by the Helper Drugs.
Do you think there's any old movies around Trinidad? Do you know anybody who has home movies from, say, the 30s?
Who ran the Bijou down there, anyway?
Are we going off the air?
Yeah.
We are going to.
I'm going to go to the Excusado, but I won't mean
I guess we've got 2 minutes on that roll.
I want to start with you telling us your family history.
from the period of the
From
strike.
the word go.
Go.
Who
All
are,
right.
I want to know who you are and how you came to be here and what this is all about.
All right. My name is Barron Beshoar. I was born here in Las Animas County. My father, Dr. Barron Beshoar, was a physician in this county for more than 50 years. During the Great Coal Strike of 1914, he was the physician for the United Mine Workers of America. He, in turn, was the son of Dr. Michael Beshoar, who came to this county in 1867 from Pueblo, where he had founded a newspaper, started a medical practice, and established the first drugstore between Denver and Santa Fe, going to Pueblo from Fort Kearny, Nebraska, with 8 wagons loaded with drugs. He subsequently moved from, he established a practice also in Trinidad and commuted back and forth between Pueblo and Trinidad by horseback or by stagecoach. He opened the Gray Creek Mine in Las Animas County, was much interested in the coal mining industry, did a great deal to promote it, and at times he was involved in some of the strikes, and he encouraged the strikers in their moves to obtain collective bargaining and the 8-hour day. His position at that time was that when he was a young man, employees knew their employers and they could talk together on a very personal basis. But by this time in the development of our country, the corporations had grown so large and the numbers of employees had grown so large that it was no longer possible. And union organization was the only answer for that sort of thing. If employees were going to talk to their employers, they had to talk through union representatives. Now, that's essentially the history of the family. Does that open it up for you?
That starts. There's another piece of business that we need to take care of, and that's where are we?
Mm-hmm. Where are we? Well, we are in Berwind Canyon. There are, in this canyon, in 1914 and up to 1929, 1930, there were 2 camps in this canyon, Tabasco and Berwind. Both of them were big camps. This canyon was filled with people, with shops, company store, all of the things that were necessary to mine the coal here. And this canyon leads down to level ground where it opens out is very near where the Ludlow tent colony was established. In the next canyon over, there were the towns of Hastings and Delawa. And the purpose in putting the Ludlow tent colony down there was to block access to these two canyons, to keep breakers from coming in. And of course, the Ludlow tent colony was peopled by men, women, and children who were driven out of this canyon, driven out of Berwind and Tabasco, and driven out of Hastings and Delawa, down onto the plains by hired company guards and deputy sheriffs, and they left some of them carrying their possessions on their backs, pushing carts, getting any kind of transportation they could get to put their meager household furnishings on. I did not see that personally, but obviously it looked like things you see today, evacuations in Africa, in Asia, the people on the march when they're being pushed out by armed force. And that's what was happening in this canyon. They were being pushed out by armed force.
And they lived in houses right here?
Yes, they did. These are all around in this canyon. You will find the foundations of the houses. After the coal mining industry which died in these canyons, the houses were torn down, ranchers and other people came in and took the houses down to get the building materials. And so all that remains today are the foundations and also some cement structures which couldn't well be moved. Most of these cement structures have steel cable in the side of them. And if you took them down, you'd have to break them up with sledges, and you wouldn't have anything by the time you had them down, you see.
It's easier to leave them set than it is to try to bust them up.
And of course, whenever structures are abandoned under our tax system, the thing you have to do immediately is get the roof off of them. If a building is standing out on an open space and it has no roof on it, it is not then subject to tax as a building.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. Car.
That explains a lot of things.
We have to locate ourselves within a much larger geographical area, I think, because most people are not going to know at all what Ludlow is or this canyon.
Okay, we are in Las Animas County, in the foothills of the county, in southern Colorado, right on the New Mexican border. This county is the largest county in the state. It's approximately 120 miles long, and it's approximately 45 miles wide, depending on where you are. The county geographically varies from the high Culebra Range on the west to this foothill type of country, which is covered with pinon and cedar trees. And almost immediately after you go out of these canyons, you go on to the prairies, which in the early days were buffalo country, and today are farms where water is available, or they are used as ranges for cattle. This county is not a cattle feeding county, but it is the largest cattle raising county in the state of Colorado. It is one of the largest sheep raising counties in the state of Colorado, and it is also one of the largest goat raising counties in the state of Colorado.
I didn't know that.
And on the southern side of the county, you have the Colorado Raton line, and the principal city is Trinidad, which is the last community in Colorado of any size before you go over Raton Pass into New Mexico, which is called the mountain section of the Santa Fe Trail. And in the very early days of development, when the wagon trains left Westport in Kansas City and headed for Santa Fe, they either took the Santa Fe Trail to the south, or they came north and went over Raton Pass.
Why was Trinidad founded in the first place?
Well, there was a large group of Spanish-speaking people who lived in Mora County, New Mexico. Mora County is near Las Vegas, New Mexico. And they were looking for better land, and so they scouted north. They decided they liked the valley in which Trinidad stands today, and they came with men, women, children, all their household possessions, seed corn and other things that they would need for farming. Now, that was the first settlement, followed shortly thereafter by Anglos coming in from the east. A man named Gray was the first Anglo settler of the county, and he settled just east of Trinidad on what is today known as Greek Creek. The famous mountain man, Uncle Dick Wooten, subsequently picked land at the foot of Raton Pass after exploring almost all of the West on foot and on horseback, and he decided that's where he wanted his big ranch. And he built his house up in the canyon there, and that was the start of the development of the area.
What about the, is a river that runs through town or something?
Yes, indeed. The river was first known to the Spanish as El Río de las Animas Perdidas en Purgatorio, the river of the lost souls in purgatory. And legend has it that Spanish soldiers making discovery journeys into this part of the country heard sounds, moaning sounds as they camped along the river, and this made them think of the poor souls in purgatory, and that's why they gave that name to the river. Subsequently, when the French came in from the north, French trappers, instead of calling it El Río de las Animas Perdidas in Purgatorio, they changed it to Purgatoire, the French word for purgatory. And then along came the American cowboys, and Purgatoire was too much, so they simply called it the Picket Wire River. And it's possible to find all three names on maps today.
How far are we from Trinidad now?
We're approximately 12 miles, so not more than that.
12 miles what, north?
Well, we're 12 miles north of Trinidad, yes. 15 miles.
Okay. How do you want to do the history thing now?
Well, I think that, you mean the Ludlow stuff and all that?
Yeah.
I think I'd rather talk a little bit first about the towns.
Okay.
Because that's much more of a
About the which?
about the towns,
Well,
about the company towns. And
Let's talk about your father then, and
Yeah.
and the doctor and all that kind of stuff, and coming up here with a buggy, and maybe that could be even a transition if we do it that way.
yeah.
Well, my grandfather traveled the entire county by buggy, and subsequently my father did too. Before he bought his first car along about 1912, he bought a Maxwell touring car. No, I'm sorry, the Maxwell was number 2. His first one was a Metz. By the time these camps were flourishing up here, he did not make calls up there. Each of these camps had a company doctor, paid by the company. Everything in these canyons was company. There was the company store, the company health plan, the company sponsored band, the company minister. Everything was paid for and owned by the company. Now, the one exception, I said the company minister. Literally, that's true. Protestant ministers were generally paid by the company here. The Catholic Church stayed out of the canyons and remained independent of the coal companies. They did not allow priests to be put on the payroll of the company. So my father did not make calls up here generally. And later, neither my grandfather nor my father. And later, when they were involved in political campaigns, they did not make calls into the canyon because it would work this way. These canyons were all under guard by the companies. And let's say that my grandfather was running for the state senate. Well, my father was running for the state senate, and they would like to come up here and campaign among the voters. And they would come to the foot of the canyon, to the gate, and say, I would like to go in and do some campaigning. And the guards would say, well, sorry, you have to have a permit from the superintendent. I'd say, well, I would like to see the superintendent. Well, he is in his office. It's 2 miles up the canyon. You say, well, I'd like to go see him. Well, you have to have a permit to go see him. So you never got into the canyon to do any campaigning. They controlled the vote. With the first immigrants who spoke no English, they used to march them to the polls. They would cut squares in the ballots, in sample ballots, and they would have these people who spoke no English, most of them, who really, they were not eligible to be registered as voters, and they'd put them into the voting booth. They have company guards all around the voting booth, and they'd have them put the ballot over, the sample ballot over the real ballot, and then mark X's in these squares. And that's the way the voting was done. So. And,
What, they were voting to try to control county politics?
They were voting to control county and state politics. And they did control it, too. The votes came out of these areas solidly Republican. And of course, in later years, after the strikes and the people were free, this, of course, became one of the banner Democratic counties of the state.
How many people were up in these canyons? Do you have any idea?
I can't tell you at this point how many people lived
Thousands, though, weren't there? There were thousands of people.
Oh, yes, there were thousands of people living in the canyon. There were approximately 10,000 coal miners in the southern Colorado field, and while not all of them were married, a great many of them were and had families. So the population of the county in that day was about 38,000. Today it's about 17,000. So you see, and that's what these empty canyons, the people are gone.
Well, coal is such a damn boom-bust industry anyway. I mean, you look at the history all along, it's left places like this. It comes and goes in waves, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. However, you know, Appalachia has gone a long time, and the coal mining districts of Pennsylvania have been there a long time.
But it's had its booms and busts, too.
Yeah.
I mean, periods in there where the people just starved, you know. They didn't move, but Christ.
But as you look around here now, this was a pretty good bust.
Almost
now,
total, I'd say.
Now, and today we're looking for new sources of energy, and of course, the President of the United States has called attention to the vast coal reserves. This county still has great reserves of coal, but these are deep shaft mines. And it's highly unlikely that there will be any revival of the coal industry in this county as long as they can strip mine coal in places like Wyoming and Montana, where you merely have to remove 100 feet of overburden or so and then scoop the coal out with vast machines. Here you have to tunnel deep into the earth. In this one canyon, one of these mines in Hastings, that mine went down to the 7,000 feet.
Jesus Christ. I had no idea.
That's right.
7,000 feet.
7,000 feet.
A mile deep.
That's more than a mile deep. That's right.
Jeez, and you thought that shaft was 360 feet.
Well, this isn't a shaft. It's slow.
This is, yeah.
It's a long ways.
It's a long ways.
When the big explosion occurred in Hastings, shortly after the Ludlow affair, 121 men were sealed in that mine down around the 7,000 foot level. It was a terrible job getting them out. They were burned and twisted and almost unrecognizable as human beings. And that mine was really not that was a great disaster, but that mine was not an exception in this county. All of these mines were gaseous and dangerous, and they had a great many explosions. Many, many, many hundreds of miners were killed in this field over the course of its life. And a peculiar thing happened too. And it was one of the reasons for the bitter strike of 1914. When a miner was killed in one of these mines, either in an explosion or a car got away and he was hit by it, or some other cause, and of course there are all sorts of ways to get yourself maimed or killed in a coal mine, they had a beautiful system. The coroner who owed his office to the coal company would select a coroner's jury, and he would select coal company superintendents and people who were beholden to the coal company to serve on that jury. And invariably, and I use that word advisedly, they found that the miner came to his death through his own negligence. And there was one period in there of, I've forgotten the exact number of years, but 15, 20 years when there was not a single exception to that. All of them died by their own negligence.
You keep saying the coal company, the coal company. Who are the coal
Well,
companies?
the two big operators in this field were the Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation, which was the Rockefeller Company, and the other one was the Victor American Fuel. And at that time, the chief officer of the Victor American Fuel was De La Chapelle. De La Chapelle was originally an engineer in Illinois. He came to Trinidad to develop the water system, and subsequently became involved in the Great Creek mine with my grandfather. My grandfather made him manager of the mine, and then in one of those things that occurred so often in those days, Chappelle and some of his cohorts in Denver managed to get the majority of the stock and got control of Great Creek. After he left the field, it might be interesting to know, De La Chapelle went into the Los Angeles basin and developed their first big electric grid work for the city of Los Angeles.
People in and out of this. There was a lot of money in this county, wasn't there?
Oh, yes, indeed. Of course there was. There was a lot of money in this county in coal, and there was a lot of money in this county in cattle. The county was rich in resources, remains rich in resources, but I don't see any hope for the coal industry now.
How did what brought these people in here? Where was the demand for coal in the early days? Your grandfather was here in 1860, did you say?
1867, he first came into the county. And
Was
of
there
course,
any coal mining here then?
there may have been a little development, but not much yet. It came soon thereafter, though, not too long. Coal was first, the railroads wanted coal. Because the railroads were building into the west, they had to have coal for their engines, and they had land development schemes. They laid out towns. For example, the Denver and Rio Grande, which was originally in the control of General Palmer. They came south from Denver and they established Colorado Springs. This was his town. A new town, the old town there was Colorado City, which is just west of Colorado Springs. Then he came on down into this county and established El Morro, 4 miles east of Trinidad. And it was the intention of the railroad to build a big town there and supplant Trinidad as the main community. It happened it didn't turn out that way, but that's the way the coal was developed. And then came the steel mill in Pueblo. And that, of course, required vast quantities of coal, and it turned out that the coal in this county was peculiarly suited to cooking. And most of these camps had great coke ovens, and at night the sky, Las Animas...
Wait.
I can't.
And a lot of dust. Okay, what were you saying about?
At night, the skies in this county would glow red because, of course, these coke ovens operated 24 hours a day. The fire came out of the top of each oven, and you got this beautiful red glow in the sky. Now, you also got a lot of pollution that would not be tolerated today in these canyons. There were sulfurous fumes. This coal was pretty heavy in sulfur. And but the coal was coked here. And then the coke was taken to Pueblo for use in the steel mill. As you know, coke is burned hotter than coal and is used in the process of making steel. Now, today the coke is made in Pueblo. And they have the pollution problem in Pueblo, and the state of Colorado has granted several variances to them, and the dispute goes on about the pollution.
Well, they don't just throw that stuff away. Those new ovens that they use, byproduct ovens, keep all that gas that comes off so they can make aspirin and clothes and whatnot out of it. In the old days, so they just burned it, right? I mean,
they
just
did
came
burn
off
it.
the stacks.
One of the funny things that happened was when many large companies, which were with vast chimneys, were burning off everything, and were finally compelled to put in devices to reduce the pollution in the air, discovered they were making more money out of the byproducts, which had been done in Germany and other European countries for years and years and years and years, but sometimes we're a little slow on that type of technology.
Well, in the early days of this country, there's a great sense of there was so much. There was so much coal and so much land and plenty of everything, and people didn't conserve very much.
Well, they thought it was inexhaustible, and then there wasn't any conservation movement of any kind. They didn't know. It all began with the slaughter of the buffalo, you know. Of course, that was not just by chance, that was by design.
You know, we find miners, though, who are upset when when the mines that they work in go in and take the easy coal. Apparently, there are a lot of these big seams of coal that get worked out improperly, and they lose a lot of coal that's left under there. And a lot of these old guys talk about that and say, you know, they think it's just not smart to go in and just take that coal out like that. So there was a little bit of that too.
Yes,
well, and by the
is.
20s, they're very conservative. People that lived through the Depression learned how to make everything do twice, 3 times. I mean, we've been chided again and again that this culture now is incredibly wasteful, even compared with the early part of this century.
That's very true.
We've gone back to this like frontier ethic.
Yeah. That's very true. The
Wait.
little was wasted by the people in these canyons in their lives. They planted gardens. They did everything they could to stretch that small paycheck they got from the mines, and they certainly weren't wasting anything up here.
Those whole mountains are made with people with little cars of rocks coming out there. It's amazing. When there was a lot of stuff moved, and I guess when you're doing it that way, you know what's what and what's where. I was sitting here thinking, here are the people sitting in these houses, looking up there, and that mine was working right here. You know, and you watch each of the rock cars come out and dump the rock, and the coal coming out. I imagine you get a sense for how much coal was coming out when you see it coming out in this little hand.
Sure, the whole process was in front of their eyes as though they were in a laboratory. You know, one of the interesting things about coal in a county such as this is that, let's contrast it, say, with the metal mines of northern Colorado. There you had to be very sharp to find the gold and the silver. You had to know geology, and you had to be pretty good to find it. It was very simple to find coal in this county. You can walk around today and see outcroppings all over the county. It was exposed, and there it was. Of course, they all ran tests in to see how big the veins were, but there was no difficulty in finding it. There it was. It was sticking right out of the ground, sticking in their faces. All they had to do was get it.
Produce.
Yeah.
Get men in there.
Right.
Yes, that's
Gold
right.
mines, but you didn't need that much.
No, that's true.
Well, you wouldn't have 300 men working underground in a gold mine, would you?
In a gold mine?
Yeah.
Well, possible. Yeah, sure, some of the big ones did. But this was heavy labor. Now, one of the interesting things that happened in these company towns was the diversity of population. As many as 32, 33, 34 languages were spoken in this county. Now, what happened there was the original miners were mostly Irish, English, Scotch, and Welsh. And as time went by, they became very unhappy with the conditions under which they had to work, or they moved up into upper levels of the company and became bosses and into sub-management. And those who didn't, finally, they would strike. Then the coal companies would go and they would recruit another group of workers. They would recruit Austrians, Czechs, Italians, Greeks, Yugoslavs, Hungarians, Mexicans, many different nationalities. Then once they got them into the mines and into the canyons, they attempted to keep them segregated. If the men couldn't communicate with each other, it was difficult for them to organize. They had to have a means of communication before they could teach each other the principles of unionism, before they could even discuss their grievances. Many of these miners up here, they couldn't read, write. They thought that the coal company was practically divine. Everything came from it, and they thought in their simplicity that their very lives were beholden to the coal companies. Well, in due time, they did learn to communicate, and they did get organized, and the many different ethnic groups brought strength to this union movement, because they all had their particular strength. Just as the United States of America has benefited greatly from the various races that have made it up, so did the Union finally. And
so they would bring in different groups to break strikes.
Sure, they brought them in to break strikes, and they'd herd them up in these canyons. They'd come in and they'd have the little peg-top pants that they wore in Europe, and some of them would have their clothes in a bundle on a stick, and a little European caps, you know, and speaking no English whatsoever. Now, how did they get them? Well, they sent headhunters. They sent headhunters to Italy, headhunters to Greece, headhunters to all of the Mediterranean and Eastern countries there. Just as in more recent times, sugar companies and large agricultural groups have sent headhunters to Mexico and started the great migration of Mexicans into the American Southwest. Now, they don't need to send headhunters anymore, because the migration is legal and illegal is taking place without that sort of thing.
Well, the European migration had an impetus of its own, too. There was a lot of famine in Europe. There were advertisements that went on through families where one brother would come and he'd bring his other brothers, and they'd bring their kids, and I mean, there was that.
But they had to bring in, it seemed like they had to bring in big groups at one time or another to get that. It couldn't all just happen on that kind of a network.
Now, a lot of them, however, did not bring their families. Many of these who came in, now this was particularly true of the Greeks. The men came, and they had been told stories of these roads up these canyons were virtually paved with gold. They were going to receive these high wages. This was just a dream world, and it was their thought they would come and work a short time, and then they would take this accumulation of money and go back to Greece and marry the Greek girl of their dreams and live happily ever after. It didn't work that way. The Greeks brought, finally, fewer Greek women came in than almost any other ethnic group. Italian women came in large numbers, and most of the others were not the Greeks. So, well, many of the, this desire to go back was not peculiar to these miners either. Many of the early day developers of the West, they didn't intend to stay out here. They intended to come out here and take advantage of the resources, make their wad, and head back to New York, Boston, or wherever they came from in the East. In fact, there's my own grandfather intended that when he arrived.
Oh, yeah?
Yes, indeed. He intended to someday go back and live in the East, where he had been born.
But life is short and the West is big. Huh?
That's right. So they didn't go back.
Wow.
I want to. I'd like to get an orange or something. I'm
I'd
thirsty.
love to have an orange.
Would you like to have that? My mouth's dry. Can we cut, Oliver? He can hear
You know-
everything that's going on.
You know, I'm not out to plug the book because there aren't any more books to sell. But in that early part, we should have mentioned the book, shouldn't we?
Oh, we can do it anytime.
Because it was done with John Lawson,
Yeah.
That's
the
right.
leader of the strike.
Well, I'd like to start talking. This person was killed during the strike, right? The guy you saw killed in the street.
Yeah, it was during the strike.
Yeah. I'd like to do the build up and tell it as maybe John Lawson might have, from that kind of a perspective early on. Like, what were the conditions here? How was it that the UMW started organizing, and how was the decision made that it was time for a strike? In Colorado, they'd been defeated in 0304, and things.
You mean
didn't-
the method of organizing?
Oh yeah, and these guys, how did they organize these camps? And
Okay,
where
that's a
did they
very
meet?
interesting thing.
And then the strike, and then see if we can. It's going to take us days and days, but if we can at least take care of hunks of it like this now,
let's do a
and
big
we'll
chunk.
try to do it thoroughly. I think it's going to take. I think it's going to take some conversational stuff. In other words, I don't think Eric and I are going to be naive on a lot of this stuff. And
Well,
we may want to actually discuss point or ask a question, and it's not as though we're trying to quiz you.
No, it's all right.
It'll be like an interview, and or not an interview. It'll be like
Well,
a
shit, you and I know a
conversation.
lot about this stuff at this point, you know.
Well,
So let's-
I'm qualified to discuss that organization bit.
Sure.
Good, okay.
Because I'm not that qualified about how the organization happened.
I can do it.
I know bits and snatches of these secret meetings going on in the hills, and what happened if you were the guy underground and that sort of thing. Maybe we should just start after 1904. It was a strike that wasn't won. They might have won a wage increase, I think, of a few cents.
Lost all the strikes.
They just went back to work because they had to.
Yeah, that's right.
So, in that period of time between 1904 and
Are we on? Are we going?
Are we going?
Yeah, yeah, we're going.
Okay.
Between 1904 and 1913, that was really some of the peak population time in these canyons, wasn't it?
That's right.
That was,
Well, that was a peak population, and the United Mine Workers of America decided that the time had come when they had to make a major effort to organize and unionize the important Colorado fields. They knew that they were going up against a tough customer in John D. Rockefeller and his Western managers, and the Victor American Fuel and the other coal companies. The operators were strong and they were united. They had armed forces, and they had their own secret espionage agents who circled around the camps and who worked as coal miners and listened to what the miners had to say. And it was much as you read today, things going on in espionage in Europe. Nowadays they do it with microphones hidden. They did it with men walking about and engaging in conversations with these people and finding out, were they reliable? Were they happy with the company? Were they subservient? Or were they talking about, we need a change, we want a raise? We want a raise is almost like saying we're going to sell out the United States of America. So, that was treason. Well, when the Union finally decided they would organize, the question came up, how are you going to get into these camps with these with this sort of guards around, with this sort of ironclad situation, and also we're going to deal with all of these various nationalities with the many different tongues. So, what to do?
pull your hair down, because Rockefeller was sort of famous for that. What I want to get to is that great principle, and I want to be able to tie Rockefeller in, even in opposition to these, what they were called in that time, enlightened capitalists in the East that were, recognizing a union, realizing that their productivity went up, and these sorts of things. So,
Go?
yeah.
Okay. Well, when the Union decided to organize Colorado, one of the initial steps was to set up a policy and management committee in Denver. The three members of the policy committee were John R. Lawson, Edward Doyle, and Frank J. Hayes, and they were to be in charge of the organizing and in charge of any strike which developed therefrom. Now, the first thing they did, they had to decide on what the problems were in the strike fields, and there were many. The men worked long hours. They were underpaid. A lot of them were paid in scrip rather than in dollars. They lived in closed camps. They had no personal freedom. They couldn't vote as they pleased. They couldn't go to the doctor of their choice. They were captives, literally captives in the coal camps in these canyons. They were cheated at the weigh scales. They were cheated on what they loaded underground. They were cheated on dead work that they had to pay for the dead work themselves. And conditions were generally abominable. Now, they were improving in the East, where the unions had made some gains. We were isolated here in the West, and the companies had the control that they'd had for many years, and the Western managers of Rockefellers, they were local in their thinking too. So, now we're going to organize. Let's say that, let's pretend for a moment, let's say that the three of us are Lawson, Doyle, and Hayes. We're going to send men down to organize these fields, and we know that if we send an organizer up and we somehow get him into this canyon, into Berwind, just the moment he is discovered, he will be grabbed by armed men, he will be beaten, and then he will be taken down the canyon, and he will be beaten again and either dumped out on the prairie, or he will be put in a boxcar and sent off to Kansas or Missouri or some other place, and they're dumped out and told, don't ever come back. So what shall we do? Well, we have a thought. We will organize two sets of organizers. We will have an active organizer, and we will have a secret organizer. We will send a team. Let's say we're going to send a team here to this camp to Berwind. So we send the active organizer, and he will set up in Trinidad or Aguilar or some open town and announce that he is going to organize Berwind. Whereupon the espionage system of the company will have him under observation 24 hours a day. Every move he makes will be known to the company. Meanwhile, we will send the secret organizer up here to rustle a job and go to work in the mine. He will be known not as an organizer. He will not know, as far as is known, he has no connection with the United Mine Workers. He is just a miner. And while he is working with his fellow miners, he will begin to feel them out. And he will find out people who are somewhat sympathetic to the idea of unionization, or have held union cards in some other part of the country. And then he'll begin to gather them, and they will have secret meetings at night. Now, some bad things are going to happen as this process gets underway. Pretty soon, the espionage system of the company is going to find that this is what is happening. And they're going to try to locate these secret organizers and get them out. Also, any man who has indicated a willingness or a desire to join the union is going to be sent out of this canyon. It is going to be known as going down the canyon. And if he just said, I think a union is a good idea.
Yeah, oranges and stuff here. Oh, geez. Sorry about that.
If he has...
I think maybe you should stay here to keep the shot the same, so we can cut. I hate to say it. Is it uncomfortable?
Well, it's hard. I'm getting a crink in my neck.
Me too.
Trying to be attentive to Brown.
If a man has so much as indicated any interest in the union, he will be taken down the canyon just as the organizer was. He will be beaten, and he will be dumped out in Kansas someplace. Well, the secret system worked. Secret meetings were held in these hills at night. And of course, as more and more came into the union, why, the thing became more and more open. And finally came the great day when the strike came into, the union came into the open. The operators refused to negotiate, refused to have...
Goddamn. That was popping, wasn't it?
Sure. I took my mic out of the circuit too. So.
No use adding. What year did they start? I mean, had they been trying to organize since well, for how long? How long did it take them to get this organization going here? When did they really decide to?
You mean precise dates?
No, how long? I mean, it took years to get these mines
Took 2 or
organized.
3 years to get them organized to the point where they could call a strike. Yeah. Yeah, this didn't happen overnight.
No.
That was Mike's job, wasn't it? He was one of those kind of organizers.
Yeah, he was in the heart as an organizer.
Was it inside or outside?
Well, he was a young man who came in late into the game and was worked, I think, mostly out of the Trinidad office.
But he told us he was up around Walsenburg. He told us about getting beaten. He was actually organizing and working inside in the camp and got caught by, according to him, Jeff Barr and
Well, could
some
well
other
be.
goons and got shit
Could
beat
well
out
be.
of him.
Terrible beating.
Could well be.
Terrific.
That's what he says. Get set up. It's so beautiful outside, it's almost worth the delays. It's gonna look
Oh, it's
good.
going to look great. It's okay.
Now, you see, we'll go from that into the strike and then the terrorism, terror tactics that the company began to use. Okay? Where were we at that point? You know?
Calling the strike. Maybe we could back up a little bit and talk about how long this kind of organization went on.
The organization of the Southern Colorado Field here didn't happen overnight. It took a matter of many, many months, ran into 2 or 3 years to really get the thing organized to the point where the union felt that it was strong enough to face the companies. Now, when the strike was called, then the company ordered the, let me say in advance, the unions were prepared to have their people evicted from the coal camps. And in advance, they had purchased tents and stoves and everything to set up tent colonies down on the prairies on free ground that was not company ground. So when the time came, the company did evict them. And the guards came to the houses and they'd throw their beds and everything out into the street and tell them to get moving. And then began the sorrowful processions down these canyons, down this road, down the road in the next canyon, down the road in all these canyons. And people with their household goods, people carrying bundles, people with bundles in carts and in wagons and in anything. There were even a few automobiles at that time. And it was exodus, and very much so.
This was in the fall of 1913, wasn't it?
Yeah, right. Down they go to the camps, and once in the camps, they were organized. They had officers in charge. For example, at Ludlow, the Greek miner, Louis Tikas, who was a very well-educated man. I understand that he had attended the university in Greece. He was in charge of that colony, reported to John Lawson and the members of the policy committee, but was in direct charge. And each camp had its own set of officers. They had regular routines set up as to how they would feed, how they wash days, set up very much like an army camp. They had a large recreation tent. They gave concerts. The various nationalities they had their own musical instruments. They set up. They had sort of intramural sports. The men played bocce, the Italian baseball game. They played baseball. They had all sorts of things, activities for all ages. Of course, they had health service. My father was in charge of the health service for this county, and he made regular calls to all of the camps, and also sick people were sent into Trinidad, where he saw them in his office, or if they required hospitalization, they were treated at Mount San Rafael Hospital in Trinidad.
Your father knew John Lawson and these people.
Oh yes, very well.
How did he get to know them?
Well, he had been active in support of the union movement from the start, just as his father had been. And they came to him early in the game and said they would like to have his help, and he gave it willingly, you see. And then they appointed him as the physician for the mine workers. This moved the whole thing into the open, and then we began what might be called a campaign of terrorism on the part of the company. Let's take the town of Trinidad, for example. That was an open town, and presumably you could do as you pleased there. You were a free citizen. You could walk about the town. You could shop. You could do what you wanted. Not exactly so, because the armed guards and the thugs employed by the coal companies were on the streets. They were harassing miners and their families. The CF&I company had gone to Virginia and imported, made a contract with the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, which had gone into the slums of New York and Chicago and hired gunmen and thugs, brought them out to Colorado. They were all over the streets of Trinidad. There were, well, I remember one night. I was a very small boy. I was riding in an open touring car with my father and my mother, and they were going home, and my father stopped to buy some hamburgers. And my mother decided she didn't want to cook dinner that night, and we get some hamburgers, as much as people do nowadays. And we were sitting in the car on Commercial Street, almost directly opposite a little bakery. And as my father came back to the car with the hamburgers, he suddenly said, "Get down." And of course, at my age, I didn't get down and pay any attention. And so I happened to then see this. A miner came out of the bakery. I didn't know he was a miner. I later was told he was a miner. He had long loaves of bread in his arms. And there were two men standing there, one on either side of the door. And I learned later, when I was older, that they were Baldwin Felts thugs. As the miner came out with the bread, one of them jostled him and knocked the bread to the sidewalk. The man looked at him, he stooped over to pick up the bread, and one of them drew a pistol and shot him to death, right there on the sidewalk. Then the two of them just linked arms and started up the street toward the intersection of Commercial and Main. This sort of thing was very, very common. There was the case of...
was the guy stealing bread, or was he just...
Oh, he was just a union man.
Just coming out.
Just a union man, that's all. This was terror. This was a terror tactics. And this was intended to intimidate miners, even though they weren't in the coal camps, and to make them afraid. Then, if you made them afraid, then the women of the families would say to the men, we've got to end the strike. We ought to go back. We ought to go back to work, see. And this sort of thing was common on the streets of Trinidad, Walsenburg, Aguilar.
Here comes this wind again. Take what we can get. Nice calm.
What does he say about the wind?
He's saying it now.
Do you want to have no wind?
No, I mean, a little bit won't hurt.
Right, well, especially because you can see it here. I mean, it's
Yeah,
not going to be unintelligible noise. It'll be...
Randy will tell me anytime it just gets shaky.
Okay,
Just lift your hand or something.
terrific. We'll just...
Now it's very faint,
Oh,
just kind of a lot. So
oh, well, this is blowing pretty good. Terrific. Let's just push on.
Oh, that was faint.
Okay.
So you say that this this wasn't uncommon.
It certainly was not. And of course, this caused the feeling between the strikers and the company to become more and more bitter as the strike went on. And both sides soon had arms. The company had long been shipping in guns for these thugs they had hired, and the United Mine Workers also began to ship in guns. Also, the miners managed to get some of the company guns. For example, I remember one shipment came into Trinidad in a boxcar, and some railroader, Union man on the railroad, tipped the miners off that the company guns were in this boxcar. And at night, someone broke into the boxcar, and all the guns suddenly wound up in the hands of the miners.
The railroads were unionized, weren't they?
They were unionized, indeed they were. And so company guns, fact is, for many years I had a .30-30 rifle that was given to me by a miner, and engraved on the side of it was CF&I Company. It was one of those guns that had come out of a shipment by the company. Then there began to be what you might, in military terms, call minor skirmishes. Now, the company felt that if they could get the militia in here, then this would give their side of this industrial dispute not only a feeling of official authority, but would add to the weight, the pressure that they could bring against the miners. And the militia was sent into the field. Also, this shifted part of the company's, what they saw as their defense posture, put part of that cost onto the taxpayers, to the tune, as it turned out, of many hundreds of thousands of dollars. In fact, the state had to issue warrants to cover the high costs of sending the militia to the field. Then once the militia were in the field, a very interesting thing happened. As you know, in those days, militia were not very well trained, and mostly they were young men in the towns and in the farms who they were patriotic, and they were willing to serve a short time in the militia and go to drill once a week. But when they had to go into the field for protracted periods, like months at a time, and lose their jobs at home and lose their incomes and be gone for months from their families, they became very unhappy. And they wanted, soon the militia boys wanted out. They wanted to go home. So at that time, they began to let the farm boy go back to Sterling or Fort Morgan or Greeley or Fort Collins, wherever he lived, and put into uniform a company guard. And then the state began to pay part of his salary. Now, at the time, late in the strike, the CF&I Company was reportedly paying these the members of this notorious Troop B, who were thugs in uniform of the state, were reportedly paying them $6 a day, which was an extremely high wage at that time. And they were also drawing their state pay of $1 a day. So their total was $7 a day, which was fine wages, you know. That,
not more than a miner made.
That was better than Henry Ford was paying. And a lot more than a miner was making. And,
some of these guys got famous. The Linderfelts. Who are these Linderfelt brothers? Didn't they follow that same career?
They followed the career. They indeed did. There was the principal one was Monty Linderfelt, who became the most notorious of the brothers, and he was one of the officers in command at the Ludlow Massacre, which of course culminated the whole affair in April 1914. There were militiamen killed, and there were thugs killed, and there were miners killed. There was warfare in Las Animas County. There's no question about it. Probably the most notorious of the gunmen was a man named Belcher, and he was killed in Trinidad at the intersection of Main and Commercial Street one night when there were heavy shopping crowds, and the miners had decided to kill him. They had decided at a meeting of miners that this man had to be killed. He was terrorizing miners and their families, and there was no way to cope with him. And during the course of the discussion about how they were going to kill him and who was going to kill him, it was brought out that the man wore body armor. And this had been, the miners had learned this in West Virginia when a similar attempt had been made on his life. The man wore steel plates in front and steel plates in back, had leather straps that held him in place, and he had a shirt of mail over that to prevent anyone from getting a knife between these steel plates. And so the night he was killed just as the clock on the corner, on the bank there, struck the hour. A miner put a gun right to his ear and fired. And I must tell you that a great many members of the community, solid members of the community, people who were not even connected actively with the strike, felt that while murder may never be condoned, this was a beneficial act as far as the general community was concerned, because this was a very bad man.
Well, sure. He had a reputation in the East.
He had a reputation in the East, and he was a killer and a murderer and a very bad man, and he reached the end that those people are supposed to reach historically. This sort of thing went right on up to the time of the Ludlow Massacre. Before the massacre, the militia were intimidating the people of the tent colony. They would ride by on their horses and shout threats and imprecations at them. They would go by in their cars and fire into the tents. And they did such little tricks as getting rusty barbed wire and stuffing it down the wells where the people got their water. And anything went as far as they were concerned if it intimidated the people. This caused the people in the tent colony to dig pits under their tents and then put a flooring over them and a trap door. And whenever they heard shots going through their tents, then they would drop into these pits so that bullets crossing through the colony couldn't hit them. They would be protected. And of course, this was one of the reasons that 2 women and 11 children died in that one hole when the big attack was made on the colony. But before that attack came, a threat was actually made at a baseball game. The militia rode up, and some of the miners' families who were spectators at this game, they called the militia names and derided them and told them to let them alone.